I'm once again going to be reading a review from my book, Mind in Evolution, as assessed through reviews of major texts. This time, The Phenomenon of Man by Pierre, Teilhard de Chardin, 1955. In 1959, leading evolutionists gathered at the University of Chicago to commemorate the centennial of the publication in 1859 of Darwin's The Origin of Species. Prominent among the speakers was Julian Huxley, grandson of Charles Darwin's most vocal supporter, Thomas Henry Huxley, and author of Evolution, the Modern Synthesis, that gave its name and its methods to the further development of Darwin's theory, the basis for today's official theory of evolution, neo-Darwinism, and the modern synthesis. Huxley titled his talk, The Evolutionary Vision. He is reported to have delivered his speech with an almost religious passion. Religion as we knew it was dying, he reported. Supernatural-centered faiths were destined to decline, to deselect themselves out of existence like non-adaptive species in a hostile environment. He introduces evolutionary man. Evolutionary man can no longer take refuge from his loneliness in the arms of a divinized father figure whom he has himself created, nor escape from the responsibility of making decisions by sheltering under the umbrella of divine authority, nor absolve himself from the hard task of meeting his present problems and planning his future by relying on the will of an omniscient, but unfortunately inscrutable providence. He concluded, quote, "The evolutionary vision is enabling us to discern, however incompletely, the lineaments of the new religion that will arise to serve the needs of the coming era." Huxley was already known for his interest in the existential implications of evolutionary theory, for the maxim, "We are evolution becoming conscious of itself." He had just contributed an introduction to Teilhard de Chardin's Phenomenon of Man, published in an English translation the very year Huxley was speaking. I take the above information from Carter Phipps' Evolutionaries, published in 2012, subtitle, Unlocking the Spiritual and Cultural Potential of Science's Greatest Idea. Phipps tracks growth in the association of evolution with spirituality up to and into the 21st century, marked by books such as Evolutionary Enlightenment, A Path to Spiritual Awakening by Andrew Cohen, who was also publisher for several decades of the magazine dedicated to the movement Enlighten Next. Where did the evolutionaries look for their inspiration? Not to Darwin. Phipps' index gives barely half as many page references to him as to Teilhard de Chardin, and even more to Sri Aurobindo, an Indian spiritual leader. And what in turn inspired them? Both were in England at the end of the 19th century, when decline of Darwin's influence left Chambers' Vestiges, the main exponent of evolution, in which appears this remarkable prediction, quote, "Are there yet to be species superior to us in organization, purer in feeling, more powerful in device and act, and who shall take a rule over us? There is in this nothing improbable on other grounds. There may then be occasion for a nobler type of humanity, which shall complete the zoological circle on this planet and realize some of the dreams of the purest spirits of the present race." I suggest Chambers is the source for this particular strand of evolutionary thinking. Now, to turn to the phenomenon of man, the manuscript was completed in 1938, but the Catholic Church forbade publication of it prior to the author's death. It was published in France in 1955. To me, a phlegmatic Englishman, much of the English translation by Bernard Wall reads like free association poetry. On the one hand, there are no examples taken from life or from scientific discovery. On the other hand, there are very few declarative sentences telling you something. There is little you could pin down and examine for whether it is true or not. Painfully apparent is that it was meant to be read, or even better, heard read, in the sonority of original French. It was not meant to be taken literally. It is poetry from beginning to end. From what I've heard about the book and from scattered references within it, I believe the author's message is based on such assumptions as the following. 1. The universe is continually increasing in complexity. This seems to me very much like the central idea in Herbert Spencer. Another assumption is associated with complexity automatically comes consciousness. Third, consciousness folds in on itself to form a shell around the Earth, the noosphere. Fourth, there is a grooving in the path of evolution leading the noosphere towards a favorable ultimate destination, what he calls the omega point. Here's a sampling of his thinking. Quote, historically, the stuff of the universe goes on becoming concentrated into ever more organized forms of matter. A powerful instrument of evolution, the coalescence upon itself of an entire phylum, from man onwards, thanks to the universal framework or support provided by thought, free rein is given to the forces of confluence. Why should there be unification in the world, and what purpose does it serve? To see the answer to this ultimate question, we have only to put side by side the two equations. Equation 1, evolution equals rise of consciousness. Evolution 2, rise of consciousness equals union affected. And then he says, the general gathering together becomes intelligible from top to bottom as soon as we perceive it as the natural culmination of a cosmic process of organization. Unfortunately, beyond scraps as these, I can't write a real review of the text because I can't digest it. I must resort to secondary sources. From Julian Huxley's introduction, quotes from that. The Phenomenon of Man is a very remarkable work by a remarkable human being. Pierre de Chardin was at the same time a Jesuit father and a distinguished paleontologist. As a dedicated Christian priest, he felt it imperative to try to reconcile theology with this evolutionary philosophy. As I discovered when I first met Pierre Teilhard in Paris in 1946, he and I were on the same quest and had been pursuing parallel paths ever since we were young men in our 20s. Already in 1913, I had envisaged human evolution and biological evolution as two phases of a single process. Man's evolution was unique in showing the dominance of convergence over divergence. It was my privilege to have been the friend and correspondent of Pierre Teilhard for nearly 10 years. He uses words like neurogenesis to mean the gradual evolution of mind or mental properties, and repeatedly stresses that we should no longer speak of cosmology but of cosmogenesis. Similarly, he likes to use a pregnant term like hominization to denote the process by which the original proto-human stock became, and is still becoming, more truly human. Indeed, he extends this evolutionary terminology by employing terms like ultra-hominization to denote the deducible future stage of the process in which man will have so far transcended himself as to demand some new appellation. In 1925, he coined the term noosphere to denote the sphere of mind, as opposed to, or rather superimposed on the biosphere, the sphere of life. He envisaged the process of human convergence as tending to a final state, footnote, which he called point omega, as opposed to the alpha of elementary particles and their energies. To final state, Huxley added the footnote final as opposed to final. Perhaps the strange facts of extrasensory perception unearthed by the infant science of parapsychology may give us a clue to a possible more ultimate state. This brings to mind Alfred Wallace's search for the key to human evolution in his day's spiritualism. As for mechanism, from phenomenon, quote, we have given too little thought to the question of what medical and moral factors must replace the crude forces of natural selection should we suppress them. We need and are irresistibly being led to create by means of and beyond all physics, all biology, and all psychology, a science of human energetics. Phenomenon represents an extreme emphasis on the role of mind in evolution. However, I regret that through its mistiness and prolixity, it gives the quest for mind in evolution a bad name. At least it does for me. If something is important, it should be said simply. Yet bear in mind that it has supported and continues to support a tradition of individual prophets. According to Wikipedia, Brian Swim, for example, is an evolutionary cosmologist on the graduate faculty of the California Institute of Integral Studies in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program. His primary field of research is the nature of evolutionary dynamics of the universe. He acknowledges being deeply influenced by Teilhard's ideas. Andrew Cohen, who I mentioned earlier as another of the evolutionaries, as I write, offers spiritual guidance at Manifest Nirvana, a place for people who want to grow emotionally, philosophically, and metaphysically in an environment that values and supports evolutionary inspired transpersonal relationships. At the very least, the existence of these prophets testifies to a continual concern with finding spiritual meaning in our evolutionary origin story.